All right, diving right in. Systems thinking. Huh. This is one of those things I feel like I kind of get it, but then
It's deeper than it seems, right? Like, we're so used to focusing on the immediate problem, the squeaky wheel.
exactly. But this is about like zooming out and seeing the whole machine network.
All of that. It's funny, one of your sources, The Art of Thinking in Systems, uses the example of a boomerang.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. Because it comes back. Not by magic, but because of how it's.
Designed, exactly. The
Yeah.
structure creates the behavior, and that's what systems thinking is all about. It's like, instead of just seeing a bunch of individual actions, you see the underlying rules of the game.
Okay, so it's like realizing traffic isn't just random, it's a system. Road construction affects it, weather, even school schedules.
Precisely. Once you start seeing those connections, you can't unsee them. It's kind of like,
Huh.
remember that example from one of the studies you included about the teacher-student relationship?
Oh, right, that it had a bigger impact on learning than even the actual lesson plan sometimes.
Exactly. It's not just about the elements in isolation. It's the interplay between them, the relationship.
Hmm.
Like, you can have the best ingredients in the world, but if you don't mix them right, bad cake.
Makes sense. So speaking of ingredients, the book breaks a system down into three main parts. Elements, which seems straightforward, like in a company it'd be the employees, the products.
Right, but focusing only on elements is a trap. Like, thinking only about individual trees, missing the whole forest. The good stuff, the magic, is in the interconnections, how those elements relate.
Ah, okay. So it's not just the what, it's the how they all work together, which brings us to the third part,
Hmm.
purpose. And that feels like where things can get really interesting or go off the rails.
Absolutely. You can have good intentions, but without understanding the system's behavior,
Hmm.
disaster. Like that example the book gives about high-stakes testing in schools.
Right, trying to raise standards sounds good in theory.
But then you get unintended consequences. Teachers feeling forced to teach to the test instead of actual learning, just to hit those metrics. Good purpose, but the system's behavior, not so much.
So even if the heart's in the right place, if you don't get how all the parts work together, you can end up with.
A mess. Yeah, sometimes the opposite of what you wanted. The system's behavior isn't always obvious just by looking at the individual pieces.
So we need to be careful about assumptions.
We do. It's about seeing the whole board, not just your one move.
Okay, so how do we go from seeing the system to actually changing it? Because some of these problems feel pretty ingrained.
Well, that's where things get tricky. The book talks about this thing called policy resistance.
Resistance, like the system itself is fighting back.
Kind of. It's like you try to make a change, implement some new policy, but the system pushes back. Think about, for example, the U.S. public education system.
Oh, yeah. Tons of reforms, good intentions, but it's a tough nut to crack.
Because it's not just one thing, right? You've got teachers, parents, administrators, policymakers, all these different actors with different goals.
So whose purpose wins out?
Right. Sometimes it feels like everyone's pulling in a different direction, and the system itself, well, it doesn't really go anywhere. The book actually uses a pretty dramatic example, Romania trying to increase their birth rate.
Oh, I remember reading about this. Didn't go so well.
Not at all. They made contraception and abortion illegal, figuring more babies, right?
Yep.
But it backfired spectacularly.
Yeah, I bet. So forcing a system to change, probably not the best approach.
Rarely works out the way you'd hope. It's like trying to jam a square peg in a round hole. The book talks about three main ways people try to tackle these sticky system problems.
Okay, so besides the force it method, which we've established as bad, what else?
There's calming down, basically stepping back, letting the system find its own equilibrium. Like, if there's too much chaos, maybe you don't intervene right away.
Interesting. So sometimes the best action is inaction.
Sometimes. It's more about choosing your battles. They give the example of Hungary, also concerned about birth rates. Instead of drastic measures, they focus on understanding why families weren't having more kids. Turned out, housing shortages were a big factor.
Ah, so address the root cause, not just the symptom.
Exactly. And that leads to the third, and often most effective approach, finding a common goal. That's when things really start to shift.
So instead of everyone pulling in different directions, you find something everyone can get behind.
Exactly. And the example they give of this is fascinating. Sweden, back in the 1930s, they were worried about declining birth rates too. But instead of forcing anything, they focused on this shared value. Every child should be wanted and well cared for.
Which, I mean, who's going to argue with that, right?
Right. So they put in place social safety nets, parental leave, things that made having kids easier, not a burden. And it worked. Birth rates stabilized, but because people felt supported, not pressured.
That's amazing. Okay, so we've got force it, bad, back off, sometimes good, and find common ground, often the best. But even with the best of intentions, systems can still mess up, right?
Oh, absolutely. Things break down. And one way that happens is this sneaky thing called drift to low performance.
Drift, like it just slowly gets worse.
Yep. It's gradual, often subtle, but over time, the system just declines. Think about a company that used to be at the top of their game.
Okay, got it. They were killing it. Everyone loved them.
And then, slowly, they start cutting corners. They stop innovating. Maybe their customer service slips. And because it's gradual, it's easy to miss the warning signs.
Until it's too late and they're getting crushed by the competition.
Exactly. Or think about it on a personal level.
Mhm.
Procrastination. You put things off a little today, a little more tomorrow.
And suddenly you're drowning in overdue tasks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we combat this drift? The book talks about the importance of clear goals. You have to know what you're aiming for and then constantly check in. Are you still on track? Are things slipping?
So regular evaluation. Can't just set it and forget it.
Exactly. And this is where feedback is crucial. You need people within the system who can point out those little drifts, those early warning signs before things go off the rails.
Like having someone say, hey, remember that goal we set? We seem to be veering off course. Course correction.
Exactly. It's about constantly adjusting, tweaking, making sure the system is still serving its purpose, and celebrating those wins along the way, no matter how small.
Because success breeds success, right?
Exactly. It's easy to get bogged down in the problems, but acknowledging those little victories keeps people motivated, keeps the system moving in the right direction. We've talked about a lot today: Romania, Sweden, even procrastination. But there's still this other concept we haven't touched on: escalation.
Escalation. Okay, that sounds a little more intense. What does that look like in a systems thinking context?
Wow.
Escalation. It does sound kind of ominous when you put it like that, like things getting out of hand.
Pretty much. The book uses the analogy of an arms race. You know, one country builds more weapons so the other feels threatened and builds even more.
Oh, right. And then it just keeps spiraling. But instead of either side feeling safer, they both end up.
Worse off, yeah. Spending a ton of resources, constantly on edge. And it's not just countries, right? Think about companies battling for market share. They slash prices, trying to undercut each other.
Or launch these huge ad campaigns bad-mouthing the competition.
Exactly. And it becomes this race to the bottom. No one really wins. So how do we stop that? Well, the book points out that escalation often comes from short-term thinking.
Meaning you're so focused on winning the next battle, you don't see the bigger picture.
Exactly. Like, yeah, you might win this round of price cuts, but is it sustainable? What happens when both companies are barely making a profit? No one wins in the long run.
So we need to think long-term. But that's easier said than done, right? Especially when you feel like you're under attack. Like in that arms race example, it must feel impossible to just chill out and not respond.
It's tough. And that's why communication is so crucial. Because often, escalation is fueled by fear, by misunderstanding the other side's motives.
Oh, yeah. If you assume the worst of someone, you're going to act accordingly.
Exactly. So having those open lines of communication, building trust, that can go a long way in preventing things from spiraling.
So it's about seeing the other person or the other company as, well, not the enemy.
Exactly. Remembering that you're both players in a larger system, and maybe, just maybe, you have some shared goals. Like in that company example. Instead of trying to destroy each other, maybe they could find ways to collaborate to grow the market as a whole.
So everyone benefits. Okay, I like that. But it does take a certain mindset shift, doesn't it?
It does, but that's what systems thinking is all about. It's like putting on a new pair of glasses. Things look different, and you start to see possibilities you didn't before.
This has been fascinating. I feel like I have a whole new toolbox for, like, understanding the world around me.
That's the goal. And remember, systems thinking, it's not just some abstract concept. It applies to everything. Your personal life, your job, even just trying to figure out why the line at the grocery store is moving so slowly. And maybe finding a way to make it move faster.
Hey, you never know. Maybe that's your next systems thinking challenge.
I'll take it on. All right, that's a wrap on systems thinking, everyone. We've covered a lot of ground today, from boomerangs to birth rates to, well, pretty much everything in between. Hopefully you're leaving with some new insights, a new perspective on how things work, and maybe even a little bit of hope that we can make those systems work better. Until next time.